reason why I'm starting off talking about the Civil War, because 4 years ago, I was in a place called Richmond, Virginia, and Norfolk, Virginia, and I went through a mini obsession learning about the Civil War. Talia, this is the American Civil War we're talking about. You don't have to worry too much about it. There was a naval officer that had become from, and he gave me a tour, and he gave me 2 books to read about the Civil War. And for about a couple of months, I was asking myself the same question: why is it that 600,000 young men had to die for what seems to be a ridiculous cause? Now, no one should get up and say, well, wait a second, the North were the good guys and the South were the bad guys, because the North, they were like pro-black and the South were anti-black, because anyone that knows their history knows that it is a very, very shallow narrative. And I'll prove it to you, because the head of the Northern armies was a fellow called Ulysses Grant that held a lot of black slaves, and the head of the Southern armies was a big tzaddik called Robert Lee, and he did not believe in slavery, and he was fighting and leading the South. And these people who are American legends, nothing to do with slavery was on their mind. It was about Southern pride and Northern pride, and the whole thing is like ridiculous, because I'm British, and you just see there all these monuments and all these famous battles. And the song that I just played you is about a poor man that goes out to fight for the South, and how his whole family was massacred by the Northerners. And today it's probably politically incorrect in the world of Black Lives Matter, because you cannot say anything nice about the South. But the bottom line is, this is a story of our history, of the American history. And what I wanted to share with you is that when you read stories like this and you ask yourself a simple question: why on earth does God allow a thing called war? War is such a horrible thing. Literally, people get this nationalistic craze into their mind that they want to go out and fight for what they believe in, the Southern way of life, whatever that means. And literally hundreds of thousands of young men have to die. But that's only half the story, because whenever a young man dies, it means that his parents are grieving for him, his brothers and sisters. Some of them are married, so their children become orphans. And the economic disaster and the poverty and the people that are slaughtered in half, in other words, people that don't die, but just are injured. This is like the craziness of the world that we live in. Now, if you think the Civil War was crazy, so how about World War One? I don't know if you ever studied World War One. Talia, you probably never studied this in school. They probably skipped straight to World War Two. But I'm going to tell you the whole of World War One in 10 seconds. It's very, very simple to learn about World War One. Basically, what happens in your local school ground playground. Basically, you have 6 kids who are like the big bullies on the block, and they divide themselves into 3 against 3. And they say, you know what? For the next 4 years, let's see how many orphans we can make and how many widows we can make for no apparent reason. So what happened is that you have one group of 3 is the British and the French and the Russians. And then the other side, you've got the Ottoman Empire, the Austro-Hungarian Empire, and the German Empire. And then basically they just like kill each other. And there's this thing called trench warfare. And no one actually knows why they're fighting, because at the end, they rearrange the map just slightly, but basically the countries are still there. Doesn't make that much difference. So the borders move a little bit to the north and to the south, but in the end, the French are still there to annoy everybody, and the Russians are still there, and the Germans are still there, and the Brits are still there, and the Austrians and the Hungarians and the Turks are still there. So what did they achieve? Nothing. They achieved nothing except for pain. Until, of course, the way that you're taught in school, the Americans came to Europe and cleaned everything up and sorted out all our problems. Secretly, we all know it wasn't the Americans. It was actually Wonder Woman. She came along, fixed our problems, and now we can all live happily ever after. Just by the way, I see a Deborah and a Tova. Do I know which Deborah and Tova these are? Are they mystery Deborahs? Hello. Hi, Deborah.
Hi.
Good to see you. And which Tova is it? You don't have to put it on. You can just say hi. We'll do like that wavy sign over here. Anyhow, what I want to share with every single one of you is the following. Hello, Tova. Okay, Tova's driving. Got it. What I want to share with every single one of you is the following thing. There is in world history a thing called war. War is something that makes no sense whatsoever. It makes no sense, like I just mentioned, that World War One, that Europe should be divided into three groupings, two groupings of three, and everyone just killed each other and killed each other. And when they wake up, you see that literally millions are dead. And no one can answer the question of why. Because at the end of the day, all that's changed is the borders. And what do people die for? They die for their country. Why should you die for your country? Why would anyone want to die for Belgium? Why would somebody want to die for Austria? What's going on over here? Why do people feel this need that it's worthwhile to sacrifice for a country? It's not just that. I started this off on purpose with a song because we glamorize the story of war. There is the Imperial War Museum back in London. Every country has a war memorial. They have, in the center of every great city in Europe, you have a huge statue with some general on a horse, and they talk about the great battles that he fought, unless you're like, it's like in Warsaw when it's the great battles that they lost. But the bottom line is that what's with that? And why is it that the wives go out and they wave the national flag and they say, yeah, go our team, go team France, go team Germany, go team England, go out, kill and kill and kill. What exactly is happening over here? Where does the need to conquer come from? And it's so awfully miserable. And if you look at the history of the world and the way that I grew up in London, the history books is basically the history of wars. That's the way they taught history in those days. And in the end, nothing changes. 2,000 years later, it's still the same countries. It's still England, France, Germany, Spain, Italy, Russia, Turkey, and nothing really changes. It's a little bit of a teeny weeny little change here and there. It's all the same. Why? Why does HaKadosh Baruch Hu allow something? Comes along Reb Tzadok Hacohen of Lublin. I just have to tell you, anyone that takes my classes, so you know I have a very healthy obsession with Reb Tzadok Hacohen of Lublin, and thank God I'm in my home now, so I can just take out my little Reb Tzadok and show off and say to you, he says the following thing. He says two things. Statement number one, that during the month of Elul, we always talk about war, which means if you went to shul this Shabbos, you will notice that the subject matter, a lot of the subject matter in the Parsha is talking about war. Last week was war. Next week is war. We always read Shaitin, Kiseitse, and Kisavo in the month of Elul. And these are stories about war. There's a lot of halacha that applies to this very day. So, for example, the halacha states that you have to have respect for a fruit tree. Whenever someone comes up to you and says to you, are the Jewish people, do they care about the environment? So the sugya, the story of our respect for the environment is found in the parsha of war. Similarly, the idea of cleanliness when we go to the bathroom, all these rules are sort of brought tangentially into the story of war. Now, the Reb Tzadok Hacohen of Lublin also points out that there is a Zohar, and anyone that takes my classes knows that, as we say in the movie, you don't mess with the Zohar. This is something that's important to remember. The Zohar brings down that the month of Elul is directly connected to the story of war. How on earth do we get to the story of war in the month of Elul? So now I want you to all take your seats and listen in, because what I'm about to tell you now is actually crazy. The parsha that we read on Shabbos, Parshas Kiseitze, begins with an interesting story about war that it's almost an embarrassment to read it. The storyline, the narrative, without Chazal, without the rabbis, just seems a tremendous embarrassment for the male gender. What does it say? When you go out into battle, which means when you are a male and you go out into battle against your enemies. Now remember, what kind of people would go out into battle? We know from the Chumash that anyone who was not God-fearing could not go out into battle. It had to be people who were tzaddikim. It had to be people that knew how to focus on what's called Yichud Hashem, the unity of God's name. So we're talking about the creme de la creme of Jewish young men. And they went out, and it says, you will see an Isha Yefas Toar, you will see a beautiful woman, and then you will desire her. So what do? So there's a process of what happens to this woman. You take her to your house, and you remove her clothing that she used for warfare. Now, I'm just going to add you some background over here. You know the phrase "dress to kill"? So whatever your mother told you, warning, when you go out in the street, do not go dressed to kill. In those days, dress to kill had a different meaning. Dress to kill means that women used to literally dress to kill, meaning they would attract on purpose the young men of the opposite army, but it was basically a decoy, because as they would come towards the girl, so then the ambush would be revealed and they would get killed that way. So literally, they used to send their daughters out to battle for the purpose of luring the soldiers of the opposite army so that they could be ambushed and murdered. The point of the story is that, well, these young women, we're talking about Jewish boys who could be married and happily married, and they see these girls and they have a desire for them. Now, I'm telling you the storyline. Chazal add a lot of information just to show you the direction that Chazal go. King David HaMelech, he had a Yefas Toar. So you start to understand that there's got to be stuff going behind the scenes, because David HaMelech is the mid of Malchus. David HaMelech was a person who was Kadosh. David HaMelech was not capable of having evil thoughts. And if he had a Yefas Toar, there must be a story, a backstory. What do you do with this young woman? For 30 days, she cries for her mother and her father. For 30 days. Ubachsa, she cries Avia V'imeh for her father and her mother. And then afterwards, when the 30 days are over, and she's not allowed to, she shaves off her hair, so she has that Sinead O'Connor look, which is not attractive without hair, and then she has to leave her fingernails, so that the fingernails is part of what makes a person attractive. When I went into public speaking, my cousin from Los Angeles, she told me that the two things that every public speaker has to do is to have their nails have to look, look decent over here, and your shirt has to be pressed. This is what she told me. It's like, whatever, okay. But the point is that this woman had to be menuvelet. She had to look disgusting and unattractive. And if you still choose to marry her, then you may do so. That's what the Torah says. And the Parsha is strange. Rashi says that the Torah is pandering to the Yetzer Hara of young men. In other words, if the Yetzer Hara exists, at least try and channel it into something that is permitted. And this whole story obviously needs some kind of a background, which we're not going to do except for one point and one point only. The Zohar says that the 30 days that she is crying for her mother and she is crying for her father, those 30 days are the 30 days of El. Now stop and think about what that means. Those 30 days are the 30 days of El. Somehow or other, Elul and war are intimately connected. As I said earlier, we read the stories of war in the Parshios that we read in the month of El, and the 30 days of where the Isha Yefas Toar, she cries for her mama and she cries for her papa, those 30 days correspond to the month of El. So obviously there's a backstory, and that's what I want to share with you right now, because obviously I don't get a chance to teach my alumni so often. So if I do, I better tell them something interesting. So I promise you, you will not be let down over here. This is a great class. It's not because of me, it's because of Reb Tzadok. Okay, I know that this is a good class. Also, it's not just Reb Tzadok, it's the way that my Rebbe, Reb Moshe Shapiro, taught it to me and my friends when I was your age. In other words, just when we were many, many years ago, we're talking about close to 40 years ago, when I heard these ideas for the first time. It was very exciting to understand how these things work. And the first thing that you have to ask yourself is the following. Let me just do a sneeze over here. And the reason why I have a cold is because it's literally 36 degrees outside, which means it is 36 degrees is like 110 in Fahrenheit. And so what we do is we put the air conditioning on, and our air conditioning doesn't have a thermostat. So it's always on freezing. It's always on freezing. So I basically have two choices: to either get sick from freezing cold or to be schmaltzing. That's just the way it works here at the moment. That's just life. So, you're all thinking, hello, Rabbi Nissel, why do you have a cold? It's the middle of the summer. It's called air conditioning. Let's get back to my narrative, my story over here. I want to talk a little bit about war. And to do so, I want to remind you of what you have learned with me and your other teachers, that every topic that is considered a fundamental topic, you want to learn about it, ask yourself the following question. Where does it appear for the first time in the Torah? Who teaches us that? This is Reb Tzadok, okay? This is Reb Tzadok, the same Reb Tzadok. He tells us this, but in a sense, much more important is the Vilna Gaon. The Vilna Gaon keeps on reminding us it's not just a concept. Like if you want to learn about marriage, you want to learn about how to bury your dead, you want to learn about how to deal with deceit, all these things, ask yourself, where does it appear in Chumash Bereshis? Also, if you want to learn about a personality, if you want to learn about a Hebrew word, last week I spoke about the word nechama and where it appears for the first time in the Torah. If you want to learn about a letter, so the Gemara in Baba Kama talks about the letter Samach, that appears for the first time in the creation of woman. And what does that mean? What does a samach have to do with a woman? So all these things are fascinating. These are fascinating discussions. Ladies, answer me the following question. Where does war appear for the first time in the Torah? What is the origin of war? And I'll give you a clue. It's not a trick question. You learned this in 5th grade. What was the phrase? Go for it, Yasmin.
Probably with the Tower of Babel.
Well, exactly. Well, first of all, you got the right personality. The man that we're looking for is called Nimrod. But it's interesting you say the Tower of Babel. Nimrod was the supreme leader of an allies for 4 countries got together called the 4 kings. And they waged war against the 5 kings. The leader of the 4 kings was Nimrod, who also, as Yasmin correctly points out, built the Tower of Babel. You'll see that the stories are connected in a moment. But the point is, Rashi teaches us that the 4 kings were very powerful and the 5 kings were relatively weak. So I talked about Europe beforehand. So if you imagine that like England and France and Germany and Russia waged war with like Switzerland and Belgium and whatever it is, and little countries like that. So obviously it was a massacre. Obviously the 4 kings were much more powerful, and they were led by this terrifying person. I don't know, Chazal say he was called Nimrod. Nimrod means Makir is Baer. He knows that there's a God in this world. He's 100% clear that God exists. U'mechaven limribo. He wants to fight against him. So try and picture in your mind some monster, like, you take Hitler and Stalin and give him the size of Hagrid with a little bit of a twist of, let's say, Justin Bieber, and that's it. You put them all together and you create this terrifying creature, and that is basically Nimrod. And Nimrod comes along and wages war. And this is the first battle, and that's how the Psukim read. Okay, now, if you read the Psukim and you say, so what's war about? I don't know, conquest? That sounds right. Taking the enemy and taking their resources and taking their young men and young women as slaves, and then just do what you want with them. That's the way that every war looks like. But that's not what the Medrash says. The Medrash gives us the backstory. There's always the backstory. There's always the analysis behind the scenes. And the Medrash tells us, and let me read this to you. It's a Medrash Rabbah in Parshas Lech Lecha, that's where it belongs. Parsha Mem Beis, Cherev Paschu Rishayim, V'darko, Darko Kashtam. This is talking about how war looks like, quoting Tehillim Perek Dalet. So what happens is that they took out their swords and they took out their bow and arrows. Why? I said Perek Dalet, I apologize. I meant to say Perek Lamed Zayin, Pasuk Dalet. Lahapil ani ve'evyain litvayach yishrei leiv. So the goal of this war, which was the first world war, the 4 kings against the 5 kings, had a secret agenda. And that secret agenda was to bring down the Ani and the Evyon, the poor man, the destitute man, and then to slaughter the Yishrei Lev, the one whose heart thinks straight. Who are these people? The Medrash tells us that the poor man is Lot. Lot was Avram Avinu's nephew. Who was the one who had a straight heart? That's Avram Avinu. I'm not going to explain now why they are called Ani ve'Evyon and why they're called Yishrei Lev. I just want you to think about what does Lot represent and what does Avram Avinu represent. The war that the four kings were fighting was really had an agenda. He wanted to kill Lot, and with Lot he wanted to lure in Avram and then kill Avram Avinu, and that was the real secret agenda of Nimrod. What is going on? So I just wanted to ask you. This is something you can figure out on your own. What do you know about Lot that is something important for us today in 2020? Lot carries inside of him a secret. Lot carries inside of him a spark of holiness. That spark of holiness, which the same Reb Tzadok says was actually created by the tefillos of Avram Avinu, went to his daughter Moab to create this creature called Moab, who is the great-grandfather of Ruth, who was the great-great-grandmother of David HaMelech and then Shlomo Melech, who in turn is going to be, after 2,500, close to 3,000 years, is going to be the Melech HaMashiach. So now, Lot carries inside of him the spark called the Melech HaMashiach. Avram Avinu is the one that taught the world about God. So Avram represents godliness in this world, and that means to take the great idea from upstairs and bring it down here. Lot represents the ability to take that idea and spread it to the four corners of the world, all the 70 nations. Every human being on this planet should accept God as their king. Now, it's crazy what I'm about to say to you, because Nimrod had a symbol on his sword and on his shield. Where's my information from what I'm about to tell you? The information is from the Ramad Valley, Rav Moshe David Valley, the great student of the Ramchal. Actually, I have the books over here. Where we go? There we go. There we go. I don't know if you saw this. This is called Sefer Halikutim of Rav Moshe David Valley. They only found a lot of this writings very recently, and in it he says something that literally is insane. That Rav Moshe David Valley writes that Nimrod was the first person to have a battle sign. Just like when we come to Hanukkah, the Maccabees always have, what's it called again? The Magen David. So Nimrod had a sign. The sign was actually a line that goes up all the way down. Up all the way down. Called the vertical line from heaven to earth. But there's another line that goes like this. It's called the horizontal line, and that line like this and the line like this was their symbol. And the horizontal line says the following: everything above that horizontal line, that's God's world. Nimrod says you can keep the higher worlds. Anything below the line, we're in charge. We're the bosses. Stop and think about what I just said. What did I just draw for you? I'm not going to draw on a piece of paper. It's the Christian cross. So we don't believe that the God of the Christians died on a cross. That's a Christian concept. It's a myth. It's not true. It never happened. The story about the God of the Christians we can discuss privately, not on a Zoom teaching class over here. What we need to know is that Christianity stood for something. It says we believe in God, but God is in the higher worlds. Downstairs, we run the show. Who was the first person to say that? Nimrod. Nimrod was actually murdered by Esav. How beautiful. Nimrod had a coat that originally belonged to Adam HaRishon. There's a lot of stories about Nimrod. He was an extraordinarily fearful person, a terrifying person. and he was the one that threw Avram Avinu into the fiery furnace. Here was his second chance to kill him, but it's not enough to kill Avram that represents God. He has to kill Lot, because Lot holds inside him the Melech HaMashiach. The Melech HaMashiach, his job is to break that horizontal line, to crack it open so that the line goes back up, north to south once again. So I'm going to ask you now to remind yourself of everything that you have learned in your history classes about war, and you'll notice a terrifying pattern. Throughout history, random nations, and I say random, throughout the planet, and again, as far as we're concerned, the world is basically the 70 nations, 35 connected to Esav, 35 connected to Yishmael. The Far East does not register in the great scheme of things. Why? That's for another day. And the Ramchal talks about it. Ramesh Chaim talks about it. It does not include Japan and China and whatever it is, the countries that are beyond India. Okay, that they're not included in the 70 nations, but everyone else basically falls under either Esav or Yishmael, and they have throughout their history the following extraordinary thing. Every so often, a nation suddenly wakes up and finds that they're strong. So in Talia's honor, we'll talk about the Brits. Okay, you got the 18th century. Suddenly, England wakes up. It's a tiny little island. Look at the map, tiny little island. Suddenly, it has the Industrial Revolution. It finds itself very, very strong. And it has naval power, and it conquers the Spanish Armada. That was much earlier. But before we know it, it feels this existential need to expand. Why? Hashem gave every nation that has strength the need to expand. It is a nationalistic instinct that every person in that country feels. So, okay, so by the time you get to the middle of the 19th century, England literally controls half this planet. They have India, they have Pakistan, they have South Africa, they have Canada, they have the Falkland Islands. For goodness sake, they have huge chunks of Africa. It's crazy what's going on. And what happens next is that eventually we find the boots of British soldiers are always, like before and after, found in the Holy Land of Israel. Why? Eventually, if you want to conquer the world, you feel this need to set your sights on Jerusalem. So England's one example, but let's start off at the beginning of history, the Babylonians. The Babylonians had an empire, but Nebuchadnezzar had to conquer Jerusalem. Then came the Greeks and the Medians, and then came the Persians, and then came the Romans. They were all obsessed with this tiny little sliver of real estate called the land of Israel, and its capital called Jerusalem, and a building called the Beis HaMikdash. Then afterwards, you have the Byzantines, and then the Ottomans, and all the way to Napoleon. Napoleon was an Akko. People don't know that. According to the stories, he was there the same time as Rav Nachman of Breslov. Okay, incredible stories, but he was obsessed. Napoleon was obsessed with Israel. And then the British were obsessed with Israel. And the Germans, Rommel was told against all military need to go and conquer Israel and wipe out all their Jews. And today, America is unnaturally obsessed with Israel. I want you to stop and think. Last week was the Republican National Convention. Explain to me why the Secretary of State gives his speech from Jerusalem. By chance, I think not. It's never. It reminds us how this tiny little country takes up disproportional amount of thought and passion of the great powers to be. They know that if you want to be you to the maximum, you've got to somehow make that line and say, God, you're up there, but we control the bottom. To do that, you got to get rid of the Jews. To do that, you have to subdue the spark that goes through Har Sinai back to the Garden of Eden that says that Hakadosh Baruch Hu has a big plan to break that line and to bring the high walls down to the low walls in perfect harmony. And that was supposed to happen with two people, Avram Avinu, who spreads God's name, and the Melech HaMashiach, who physically conquers all the nations and brings them under HaKadosh Baruch Hu. He conquers them not with a sword. Mashiach doesn't have to be a fighter. He does it through the kedusha of his essence. So you have these two people, Avram Avinu and Mashiach, at the beginning of time. At the end, Avram representing Hashem, and Lot representing the Mashiach ben David, who will spread Hashem's message to all four corners of the world. They are the ones that Nimrod, who is the source of all nationalistic feeling, this is where it all begins. I just want you to know that Rav Wachsvogel, the Mashgiach of Lakewood, used to make a comment about sports. It's an incredible thing how the psychology of sports works. I imagine that Talia Cantor, your husband's probably a Manchester United fan. I don't know how these things work, but there's probably, whatever it is, every one of you, you know that the men folk who are the aggressive types, they always have to have a sports team. It just works out that way. And the only games that bring out the most passion are nationalistic games. When there's a World Cup, literally all other wars comes to a standstill, and everyone is obsessed with their team has to win. I don't know if you remember during the times of communism. How could you remember? But you may have heard about this. So when America would play Russia with some stupid sport like hockey, so the whole world would come to a standstill. This was like a world war, this game. They were fighting for nationalistic pride. So where does that come from? So thank God, as Rav Wachsvogel says, thank God they're killing each other on a pitch, over a ball instead of with guns and with swords. But the bottom line is that the need to do so goes back to the same Yesod. Let me summarize what we have learned today so far, because now I'm getting to the main part of the class. What we've learned today so far is what's called the great secret of war. What does war mean? War means that Kadosh Baruch Hu put into the heart of nations the need to assert themselves. It is part of their national psyche. And every single nation, without exception, the moment that they feel that they are strong, the moment that they feel that they have the kach to do so, they will always do one thing and one thing only. They will set their eyes on Jerusalem. They will set their eyes on the Ani ve'Evyain, which is the Melech HaMashiach, and the Yishrei Lev, which is Avram Avinu. These are the Hashem put it into their essence, and their symbol, which is the line like this, and then a line like that, is making the same consistent statement that goes through Esav back to Nimrod, that says, Hashem, you can stay in the higher world. And we don't have problems with Jews that are up there in the higher world. But down here, we run the show. We're in control. Now, listen very carefully. Milchama, which is unfortunately the story of mankind. And as I'm speaking to you, some poor young man is dying for some ridiculous cause somewhere on this planet. There are probably 30 wars going on as I speak somewhere on this planet. But what's called the warrior instinct, the fighting instinct, the Milchama instinct, is found between another set of enemies on the one side, on the other side. And this is not Nimrod versus Avram and Lot, but rather it is the Nimrod inside of me and you, and the Avram and Lot inside of me and you. And to do that, I need to give you some background, because the Medrash brings down that when God created the world, he created the universe called the Olam Malay, and he created man as a microcosm of the universe. Everything that you can see in the universe, you can find identical or equivalent in humanity. I don't know exactly how it works, but if the Shekhinah comes down into this world, the same way your neshama comes down into your guf. And if this world has mountains, and this world has oceans, and this world has deserts, then you should be jolly well sure that you have inside of you mountains and oceans and deserts. And the battle, the Milchama between the Nimrod side and the Avram and Lot side that goes back in history to the beginning of time is the same battle that goes on inside of us, that is continuous, that is without fail going throughout history, we have this constant battle inside of us that is never ending. And with that, Reb Tzadok Hacohen explains that when you go out into war against your enemies, the enemy is the inside Nimrod that we all have. It is that inner Ra that is telling us, trying to bring us down and trying to make that bridge line between the higher worlds and the lower worlds. That's what war inside of us is going on. And I'm telling you a little secret that every single one of you listening knows I'm telling the truth. Because unlike the animal kingdom and unlike the angelic kingdom, angels and animals don't have this war zone inside of that. And there's no such thing as a bad dog. There's only bad owners of dogs. Dogs are all good. Cats or animals are all good. All Hashem created are naturally good, except for humanity. Humanity has inside of us this battle zone that who's in control, the Nimrod or Avram Avinu and light that has the spark of Mashiach. Those are the two things that are constantly fighting. Says Reb Tzadok, the 30 days that the Zohar is talking about is the month of El, because the month of El is the decisive month, the decisive battle month that will decide how Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur, which is basically our future, is going to bear out. These 30 days, you cry for your mother and you cry for your father. Who is your mother and who is your father? There's many ways of understanding this, but the simple way of understanding your mother and your father is that your father is your intellect and your mother is your heart, which means every single one of us has a set of intellectual values, what you hold to be very dear to you. So again, if you follow American politics, the people will argue with you on an intellectual level about what they believe in. But then there's the other dimension, which is the passion, which represents the culture that comes with it and everything else that draws us in on a more emotional side, that these are the things that we believe to be truths and we're prepared to fight for them. So one is the mother, the father, the mother, and these are what you cry for 30 days, which means if you want to make the switch over from the world of Nimrod, where you came from, to the word of Avram and Mashiach, where you're going to. So you need to cry. Crying, when you cry, you always go through a moment where you cannot see. If you have a good cry, so your eyes become blurry, and then after you wipe away the tears, and you see afresh. And this is symbolic of what the Isha Yefas Toar, which represents Klal Yisrael, with our inner battles, do when you want to reject your past and you want to prepare yourself for your new husband, which represents the Shechina, HaKadosh Baruch Hu, which is what Avram Avinu fought for, and what light stood for by holding inside of himself the spark of the Melech HaMashiach. So how beautiful is this? In the month of El, we read about Milchama, because in the month of El, that's when we need to be focusing on our inner battle. And we're all, in a certain sense, this Yefas Toar, we're all, in a certain sense, going through these battles inside of us, and we need to learn how to take sides. And my challenge to every single one of you that's listening to me is that in the month of El, ask yourself, so where are my battle lines? What am I supposed to be fighting? You know, when it means to fight, it means when you hit that moment of lack of comfort, that moment where you feel you're pushing yourself. And you push yourself too much and you go too fast, too quickly, you're going to lose the battle. But if you know exactly what you're ready to do, if you're ready to go from level 6 to level 7, that's your war zone. That's your Milchama of the month of El. So every single one of you has to ask you, where am I holding? What's the mother and the father I have to reject? For example, let's say music. The culture of Western civilization comes with music. The music is addicting. If I want to free myself of that music, you can't just go like that, I'm not listening to anymore. You know it doesn't work. It's a battle. It's a fight. It's a Milchama against the inner Nimrod. If whatever it is that attracts you out there are people that are obsessed with their careers. And that also comes from Nimrod. I don't mean a healthy concept that you have to earn your bread so you can build a Torah family. I'm talking about when you look into their minds, after 9 to 5, they're thinking about money. And people talk about money, and it becomes an obsession. It also comes from Nimrod. And all these things are all part of this thing that we have to go out and put a line over here, and we're in control of everything that happens underneath, and we do what we want. To fight that, you have to go into a battle zone. So I want to finish this class off with a story, if I may, just to inspire us, if that's okay, if it's a little bit okay. I want to talk about a man. Let me just see if here he is. I want to show you a picture of him. This is my grandfather. I happen to have this picture over here. I don't know if you can see this. Can you see this picture? You see 6 people over here. The top, in the middle, is a woman. That's my mother. Her yahrzeit is in 3 days. And on the bottom left, I think it is a man that looks like Charlie Chaplin. It's my grandfather, my opa. So I actually remember him from London, even though when I was growing up, he was a very sick man, stomach ulcers. But he was what you call an Erlich Hayid, a Jew that was very simple and straight and straightforward. And even though they escaped literally 1 month before World War II began, they escaped from Germany. But before, when he grew up in what back then was called the Austro-Hungarian Empire. And in World War I, he fought for the Austrian-Hungarian Empire. And I started the class talking about World War I a little bit with this agenda because I wanted to share with you the story. He was a soldier in the Austro-Hungarian Empire. He was fighting the Russians. And the time of the year was exactly this time of the year. In 2 weeks, we're starting Slichas. For Yasmin, I know that our brothers, Achina Sfaradim, you hear them here in the morning. You guys are ready. Whoa, you're right into it. But we, pale faces, we start off 1 week before Rosh Hashanah, and it was the night of Slichos. And my grandfather, the simple Jew, he says, I want a minyan for Slichos. He walks around the barracks and he gets together 6 Jews. He needs a minyan. Now, my wife says I'm crazy. I don't know where I get it from. I always assume it from my dad's side. But tell me if this is not crazy. He wants a minyan. At night, he crawls on his belly from the Austro-Hungarian side to the German side, to the Russian side. You understand how dangerous this is. You talk about irresponsible. You talk about putting your life in danger. He is going now to the enemy side. He gets to the Russian side and he starts whispering, a minyan for slichas, a tzenta for slichas. And suddenly out of the shadows, his fellow Jews come out of nowhere, Russian soldiers and Austro-Hungarian soldiers. And they crawl back with him on their bellies, and together they daven together in a minyan, knowing that the next morning they're going to be shooting at each other, knowing that the next morning that there's the possibility that they will shoot and they'll hear at the other end a person scream Shema Yisrael. Unfortunately, this is part of our history. But how beautiful is this story? The Kedusha of Klal Yisrael, Nebuch Yidden, stuck in the Russian army, the Austrian-Hungarian armies. So they had a chance, and at the fear of their own lives, they would get together to make the Slichus minyan. I want us all to have that little bit of that spirit of craziness for HaKadosh Baruch Hu's mitzvos. This is how you become a fighter. And what do you get at the other end? You get everything. You get the Shechina, which is basically Mashiach and Olam Haba, what Lot stands for, and what Lot's legacy with Mashiach with David is going to bring to this world. You want to be part of that? So the month of Elul has to be that battle zone. I'm sitting here in Yerushalayim, Ir HaKadosh. I give you all that bracha of Kedusha, if I can, that you should all find inside yourself the ability to make those big decisions and to go out and to wage those battles that are necessary. And Be'ez Hashem Yisbarach, we should all be able to laugh together when that line, that horrible line created by Nimrod and Esav all the way back to today in 2020 with Western civilization and Christianity, that line is broken once and for all. And that straight, pure line that goes from heaven down to this world, makes the whole world in perfect harmony, Shemayim Ba'aretz, in perfect harmony with the coming of the Melech Mashiach. We should all be Zeichet Meher B'Yameinu. I wish you all a Ksiva V'Chsima Tova and a good year. Thank you so much for listening.
Thank you so much. That was so amazing. Really, that was amazing.
Amen. Thank you so much, Vanessa.
Take care. All the best. Thank you so much.
Rabbi
Thank
Nissel,
you.
question? Rabbi Nissel, oh, he left.